September 7th, 1940, 2037 hours, Liverpool Street Station, London. Mary Fitzgerald descended the escalator with her two children pressed against her sides, each clutching a pillowcase stuffed with blankets. Above them, air raid sirens wailed their mechanical scream across the East End. The platform was already thick with bodies. Families claimed sections of concrete with the quiet desperation of people who understood that 6 inches of territory might mean the difference between sleep and sleeplessness for the next 10 hours. She found a space near the curved tunnel wall. Cold radiated through the tile. The smell hit her immediately. Unwashed bodies, damp wool, urine from the far end where someone had relieved themselves between the tracks. Her daughter, 6-year-old Ruth, began to cry. Not from fear of the bombs, from the crush of strangers and the fluorescent harshness of lights that would burn all night. This was night 1 of what would become 1,127 consecutive nights of German bombing. By morning, 430 Londoners would be dead. Liverpool Street Station held 10,000 people that night. The government had not authorized this. They had, in fact, explicitly forbidden it. The people came anyway. 3 weeks earlier, the Ministry of Home Security had been clear in its position. Tube stations would not serve as public shelters. The reasoning was bureaucratic and, in its own way, logical. The underground needed to continue operating as transportation infrastructure. Mass sheltering would disrupt service. More critically, government officials feared creating a shelter mentality, a psychological dependency that would sap civilian morale and normalize retreat rather than resilience. They had built alternatives. Anderson shelters in back gardens, Morrison shelters that doubled as kitchen tables, large public shelters in basements and reinforced buildings. These would be sufficient, they insisted. The Blitz proved them catastrophically wrong. When the Luftwaffe began its sustained bombing campaign on September 7th, Londoners made a simple calculation. 100 feet of earth and concrete offered better protection than corrugated steel in a garden or a table frame in a living room. They had watched the bombs fall. They had seen what high explosives did to buildings, to streets, to human bodies. So they broke the law. At Liverpool Street, Aldwych, Elephant and Castle, and 76 other stations across London, people simply walked down the escalators as air raid sirens sounded and refused to leave. Station staff, equipped with no training and no authorization for this scenario, were powerless to stop them. What were they supposed to do? Physically remove pregnant women? Drag children back up to the bombing? By September 9th, the government surrendered to reality. Herbert Morrison, the Minister of Home Security, issued new guidance. Tube stations would be opened as shelters. The transformation could begin. Chaos has its own logic, but it's an inefficient logic. In those first weeks, the platforms were scenes of barely controlled disorder. People arrived in early afternoon to claim space, spreading blankets in a first-come territorial system that rewarded those who could abandon their workday earliest. Families slept directly on concrete. There were no toilets beyond the station facilities, which were immediately overwhelmed. No organized food distribution, no medical care. No lights-out policy, which meant crying children and arguing adults competed with the thunder of trains still running until 11 p.m. The London Passenger Transport Board, responsible for running the Underground, watched this with institutional horror. Then they did something remarkable. They decided to make it work. Within 2 months, the transformation was visible. The board installed 22,000 bunk beds across the shelter stations, metal frame affairs with canvas stretched across, stacked 2 high along the platform walls. Each bunk was numbered. Each shelterer received a ticket for their designated bunk. First-come territorial warfare gave way to an organized reservation system. You could leave during the day, return at night, and know your space would be there. They brought in chemical toilets, positioned at the tunnel ends with makeshift privacy screens. Not pleasant, but functional. The board hired staff specifically for shelter management, wardens who enforced rules, settled disputes, and maintained order in an environment that could easily have descended into mob rule. By December 1940, Liverpool Street Station had become something nobody had planned for and few had imagined. It had become a village of 10,000 people, underground. Each station developed its own character, its own social architecture. At Elephant and Castle, the Jamaican and West Indian families clustered near the northern platform, creating what amounted to a Caribbean enclave 100 feet beneath South London. You could hear calypso rhythms on harmonicas after the trains stopped running. At Aldwych, which had been closed to regular service and converted entirely to shelter use, the demographics skewed elderly, pensioners who had nowhere else to go and no homes left to return to. Liverpool Street became known for its children, hundreds of them, ranging from infants to teenagers, whose families had refused evacuation to the countryside. Ruth Fitzgerald and her younger brother were among them. They learned to sleep through the muffled crump of bombs hitting buildings overhead. They learned to navigate the platform geography, the good spots near the escalators where air circulated, the bad spots near the tunnel mouths where diesel fumes from maintenance trains would make you nauseated. The children created games, racing programs where they'd time how fast they could run from one end of the platform to the other, trading cards featuring RAF pilots instead of football players, a peculiar form of hopscotch adapted to the tiles, with numbers marked in chalk that station cleaners would wash away each morning only to have them reappear each evening. The London County Council, recognizing that childhood continued even in crisis, established underground libraries. Volunteers brought books down the escalators in canvas bags. By early 1941, Bethnal Green Station had a collection of 4,000 volumes, organized with a card catalogue system and regular lending hours. Children read Treasure Island and Alice in Wonderland, while bombs destroyed the world above them. Medical care formalized. The Red Cross and St. John's Ambulance established first aid posts at major shelter stations, staffed by volunteers who treated everything from asthma attacks triggered by poor air quality to the births of babies whose mothers had gone into labor during bombing raids. Between September 1940 and May 1941, 14 children were born in tube station shelters. All survived. Human beings are adaptive creatures. We normalize the abnormal with stunning speed. By winter of 1940, the shelter communities had developed routines that would have seemed absurd 6 months earlier, but now felt permanent. Entertainment emerged organically. At Leicester Square, a piano appeared one night. Nobody ever determined who brought it or how they got it down the escalators. A rota of volunteer pianists formed. Music hall songs, classical pieces, hymns on Sunday nights. The singing was often off-key and always too loud, but it filled the tunnels with something other than the sound of anxiety. Aldwych hosted regular lectures. An Oxford classics professor whose home had been destroyed in October gave weekly talks on Roman history. The irony of discussing the fall of empires while sheltering from bombs aimed at destroying the British Empire was lost on no one, least of all the professor, who opened each lecture with a small smile and the phrase, "Shall we discuss other people's catastrophes?" Food became communal in unexpected ways. The official policy was that shelterers would bring their own provisions. In practice, sharing happened. Women with working ovens at home would bake extra bread and bring it down. The smell of fresh bread in a tube station, yeast and warmth cutting through the perpetual dampness, became a sense memory for thousands. Thermoses of tea were passed among strangers. Children who arrived crying with hunger would be fed by whoever had extra. This was not universal kindness. There were thieves. There were con artists who would claim bunks weren't theirs, who would steal blankets and ration books. There were territorial disputes that escalated into fights serious enough to require police intervention. But the default mode tilted toward cooperation because the alternative was obvious. Alone, you were more vulnerable. Together, you might survive. The ethnic and class mixing was unprecedented for London. Liverpool Street drew heavily from the East End, Jewish families from Whitechapel, Irish dockworkers, Cockney. Working class who had never been west of the city. They slept next to bank clerks who commuted in from suburbs that no longer existed, next to West Indian seamen whose ships were trapped in London harbour by the blockade, next to elderly Russian émigrés who had fled one revolution only to find themselves sheltering from another kind of violence. The shared vulnerability created temporary egalitarianism. Your accent mattered less when a bomb didn't discriminate. Your peacetime social position meant nothing when everyone was sleeping on canvas bunks. This was not romantic. The official records, compiled with bureaucratic precision, tell a different story than the one about community and resilience. The air quality was atrocious. The London Underground had never been designed to house thousands of people breathing, sweating, and living in sealed spaces. Carbon dioxide levels regularly exceeded safe thresholds. The board installed ventilation fans, but they couldn't overcome the basic physics of too many bodies in too little space. Respiratory infections were constant. Tuberculosis, which had been declining in London before the war, saw a resurgence among shelter populations. The noise was psychologically destructive. The tube trains continued running until 20,230 hours most nights. The metallic screech of wheels on rails, the pneumatic hiss of doors, the announcements echoing through platforms now serving as bedrooms, all of this happened 2 feet from where people were trying to sleep. Then, after the trains stopped, the bombs. Muffled through earth and concrete, but audible. Each impact a reminder that survival was probabilistic, not guaranteed. Mental health deteriorated. No contemporary term existed for PTSD, but the symptoms were documented. Uncontrollable shaking, inability to sleep even when exhausted, violent responses to sudden noises, children who wet their bunks nightly despite being well past toilet training age, adults who couldn't bring themselves to go back up to street level even during daylight hours when no raids were occurring. The tragedy of Bethnal Green Station on March 3, 1943, revealed the fundamental danger of the shelter system. An air raid siren sounded. People rushed for the entrance. Someone tripped on the stairs. In the crush that followed, 173 people were crushed to death. Most were women and children. It was the largest loss of civilian life in a single incident in Britain during the entire war. And not a bomb was involved, just panic and stares and the terrible physics of crowd dynamics in confined space. But here's what the government officials who had opposed tube sheltering had failed to understand. The psychological value of the system exceeded its practical value. The bombs killed approximately 43,000 British civilians during the Blitz. The tube shelters saved thousands of lives, certainly. But more importantly, they saved London's will to continue. Every night, people descended into the underground and survived. They woke up the next morning, returned to jobs in buildings that might not be there the following week, and kept the city functioning. The shelter communities became proof that normal life could persist. Children still read books, people still fell in love, romances began in tube stations that led to marriages after the war. Neighbours still quarrelled about trivial things. Birthday parties happened on platforms. Christmas was celebrated underground in December 1940 with decorations made from newspaper and singing that echoed through tunnels originally designed for transit, not hope. The 15,000 regular shelterers, the people who came every night, who had their assigned bunks, who knew their neighbours' names, formed the psychological core of London's resistance. Not resistance in the military sense, but resistance to the Nazi assumption that bombing civilian populations would break morale and force political surrender. It didn't work. Partly because of the bunks and the libraries and the tea and the singing, partly because when you've spent the night sleeping next to the same people for months, you develop a stubborn refusal to let them down by giving up. The last major raid of the Blitz occurred on May 10, 1941. Hitler, preparing for the invasion of the Soviet Union, redirected the Luftwaffe east. The bombing of London didn't stop completely. V-1 flying bombs and V-2 rockets would come later. But the sustained nightly raids ended. The shelter populations declined gradually. People returned to their homes, or to the rubble where their homes had been. The bunks were dismantled. The libraries were packed up. The stations returned to their original purpose, moving people from place to place, not housing them. Mary Fitzgerald and her children stopped sheltering at Liverpool Street in June 1941. Their building in Stepney had survived with minor damage. Ruth, who had spent 9 months of her childhood sleeping underground, had trouble readjusting to a bedroom. The silence felt wrong. The safety felt uncertain. She would wake up at night, disoriented by the absence of other people breathing around her. But she adjusted. Children do. Walk through Liverpool Street Station today. Commuters rush past the platforms where 10,000 people once slept. There's a small plaque, easily missed, that mentions the wartime use of the station. Most people don't notice it. But the transformation that occurred in those tunnels between 1940 and 1941 represented something profound about how human beings respond to existential threat. The initial governmental resistance to tube sheltering came from a fear that people would retreat, would hide, would lose the will to fight. What actually happened was the opposite. The makeshift communities that formed in the underground became laboratories for social organization under pressure. They proved that bureaucratic systems could adapt rapidly when necessity demanded it. They demonstrated that strangers could form functional societies almost overnight when survival depended on it. They showed that children could find normalcy in the least normal circumstances imaginable. The 15,000 regular shelterers were not heroes in the conventional sense. They didn't storm beaches or fly fighter planes. They slept on canvas bunks in fluorescent light, while London burned above them. They shared tea and bread. They read books to children who should have been in their own beds. They created libraries and concerts and birthday parties in the least likely locations. That was the victory. Not military or strategic, but human. The refusal to let catastrophe erase ordinary life. The insistence that a tube platform could be a neighborhood, that survival could include dignity, that even underground and under bombardment, people could be more than just afraid. Ruth Fitzgerald died in 2003 at age 69. In her final years, she would sometimes tell her grandchildren about the months she spent sleeping in Liverpool Street Station. They would ask if she was scared. Every night, she would say, but we sang anyway.